Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Winvic Pavilion. Just to give you a bit of background about who Winvic are, we're a Tier 1 main contractor. We were formed in 2001, and this year is our 25th year in business. So we predominantly work in industrial and logistics, data centres, multi-room, and civils and infrastructure. In industrial and logistics, in the last 4 years, we've delivered 100 low-carbon net zero buildings, and following a forum that we were on last year, we were asked to, with regulatory bodies, to look at how we could take the next steps into putting the net zero building standard into policy, which is why we're here today for this discussion, and obviously to look at what the steps are, what the challenges will be, and obviously launch the white paper that was issued on Tuesday. Thank you.
Great, thanks Aaron. Morning everyone, I'm Rebecca Evans. I'm the Head of Infrastructure at ING. We're the Strategic Communications Specialists for the built world. Very warm welcome to the panel this morning. Thank you all for coming. We're going to be discussing, as Aaron said, what the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard is, why it matters, and start to talk about how the industry and policymakers can make it a success, basically, from this point. Before we get into the detail, just a quick reminder about why we're talking about this and why the standard is important. The built environment sector accounts for around 25% of the UK's total carbon footprint. So for the UK to achieve the legally binding commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050, it's vital that the built environment sector is ambitious, united, and gets on with the job of reducing emissions. Everyone who's been here this week at UK Reef will probably agree that, generally speaking, the will is there. So the question really is, how do we make this happen? Our particular focus in this discussion this morning is going to be about how the standard can be made to work within industrial and logistics development and operation. And the reasons for that are that industrial and logistics is obviously an important segment of the built environment in terms of development, and so its contribution is important. And arguably, industrial and logistics also maybe has a higher proportion of development than some other parts of the sector, where development takes place without the end user necessarily being known at the outset. So given that this standard focuses not just on design and development, but also on in-use performance, it needs to be thought about quite carefully for this part of the sector. We've got a great panel here with really complementary experience of different aspects of developing and thinking about the standard itself, how it will and how it should affect our thinking about net zero, both in development and in the operation of industrial and logistics assets, and what is needed next to maximise the standard's chances of success. I'm going to ask the panellists to introduce themselves in just a moment. But before I do, I'd just like to point out the Slido code that I think is on the slide there. I have got it on my phone as well. So we'll take questions towards the end. We'll have a discussion and ideally look to go to Q&A about 11:15. But if you'd like to start posting questions while the panellists are talking and while they occur to you, that'd be great. And then we can move swiftly onto those. But we will have a roving mic as well. So I'm going to start at the far end of the panel with Ollie. Can I ask each of you to just introduce yourself in a sentence or two and just very briefly outline your interest in the standard?
So I'm Ollie, Head of Portfolio Management and ESG at Panattoni. We're UK and Europe's largest speculative logistics developer. Obviously, interested in the standard, we've put 2 schemes forward as part of the pilot, working closely with Winvic. Winvic's our partner in this. So yeah, happy to be here and sitting here with fellow panellists.
Thanks, Ollie. James?
Morning, everyone. I'm James Lomas-Holt from Ridge & Partners. We are a multidisciplinary property consultancy, about 1,500 people across the country, work in all sectors, all disciplines. I specifically am in the sustainability team, so my job is to advise clients on how they can deliver sustainability strategy, turning what they want to do into kind of how it works on projects, be that embodied carbon, net zero carbon, other wider sustainability strategies.
Great, thank you. Mike?
Hello, I'm Mike Reeder. I'm a Member of Parliament for Northampton South. Northampton is the home of Winvic. I am also the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Excellence in the Built Environment. it's particularly interesting to me, A, because Northampton is a logistics hub. 1 in 5 of my constituents work in the logistics sector. But actually, before I was elected, I worked in industry for the best part of 20 years in civil engineering, procurement, commercial management, and finally business leadership at Mace.
Thank you, Aaron.
My name's Aaron Tanager. I'm Technical Service and Sustainability Director at Winvic. So obviously we've been working in industrial logistics for 20 years, and over the last 5 years we've been implementing the definition framework and moving into the standard.
Thank you. Philippa.
Hi everyone, my name's Philippa Birchwood. I'm Head of Climate Action at UKGBC. UKGBC is a membership organisation representing over 600 organisations across the built environment value chain. We're one of the founding organisations and obviously helped to make sure that the standard happened, and also we've been on the governance board and also the technical steering group.
Great, thank you very much. Philippa, sticking with you for a second, can you start by giving us all a sort of overview of what the standard is and why it matters, why it's been developed, without focusing on industrial and logistics specifically for now?
Yeah. So I think it was a real need ever since the framework, so the Net Zero Carbon Buildings framework came out back in, I think it's 2019, 2020. We saw how the industry responded to that. There was a lot of market research that was conducted looking into whether the industry was ready for criteria and limits. And obviously from that, that helped us to deliver the standard with other founding organisations. So it was an industry need. It was responding to an industry need. And obviously, you mentioned earlier why it needs to happen more broadly. We had the whole life carbon roadmap update that was released in 2025. And, we're looking at a reduction of about 14% in terms of built environment emissions, and we really need to be seeing 24% at least. So it's part of the puzzle, and obviously a really key part of the puzzle in helping us to decarbonise the built environment.
And how does it differ from what already existed or what had come before?
What we've got is really clear limits and criteria. There's a pass-fail metrics, but we'll go into how people can also engage with it who are just nascent to this. So yeah, it's what we need. Obviously, we need something. We need a spotlight on something to keep us going. And obviously, there were some limits associated with some sectors associated with the built environment, but not all. And I think this is what the standard is helping to deliver.
So it's piecing together something that works for all sectors, setting the same or equivalent targets,
Exactly.
and focusing on performance as well as
Yes,
development.
and exactly. And that's obviously the other key thing with the standard is that it's not just a limit of practical completion. It is really about that evidence base and that actual delivery and making sure that we're closing the performance gap and seeing some real data during operation.
Okay, thank you. James, I think previously we talked a little bit about industrial and logistics and maybe not having the same tools or the same ability to measure within industrial and logistics around sort of sustainability that perhaps some other sectors have been a bit further ahead or had easier tools to use. Can you describe how this can be used for INL?
So industrial logistics didn't really have a sector focus. So a lot of other sectors like offices and homes, naturally, there was a lot of guidance out there, a lot of targets that were formed in the industry for those sectors. Industrial logistics hasn't had that, so it's largely been self-driven. So there are a lot of developers, industrial logistics developers, who have been making their own targets because that is what they had to do up until now. And so even though the industry-wide guidance hasn't been there, the sector itself is actually quite mature in its approach and has been driving it themselves. But it's fantastic now that the standard does provide us with some limits specific to industrial logistics. It's a real step forward.
Okay. And Ollie, can you describe perhaps a little bit as a sort of asset manager and developer, how the standard is different from perhaps what you were doing before or what it helps you to do?
I think the standard just sets out clear targets for us. Obviously, there's some concerns, I suppose, from us as a speculative developer. It focuses heavily on operational carbon, which don't correct me. I believe that's the right thing to do. It needs to focus on that whole life cycle. But as a speculative developer, we don't know what our end occupier is going to be. But the standard sets out a clear, framework that we need to follow, sets the targets. As James says, industrial logistics has always sort of pushed itself along. We're always competing against other developers, almost to provide, that grade A building to make sure the investment value is there. And that's where, you then start to come into account with green premiums and brown discounts and the investment side, which is, another tangent we could go down.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we can do. Yeah. And Aaron, from your perspective, I mean, you mentioned a little bit about the white paper there. Why is the standard so important from your end of things as a contractor?
I think it's just about putting everyone on the same level playing field, so making sure that everyone is being tasked and administering the same thing, and any loopholes that have been there previously are now closed. Everyone has to report on the same set of materials, the same elements, and obviously whatever you're saying at your design stage through to PC of that building, you now having to demonstrate you can implement it and that building is doing what it says it was designed for. So when you're looking at operational models, you've got the facility to show the developer, the tenant, how that building is going to be used, and obviously then it's down to the developer and the tenants to ensure that building does meet that requirement. And if it doesn't, there's then got to be facilities in place for it to change, either putting additional renewables on or looking at alternative strategies to meet that net zero on track requirement.
Thank you. And Mike, just thinking perhaps about your constituents, but also drawing on your previous experience, is this something you feel people are crying out for, or is it something that's going to need to be sort of gently imposed, perhaps?
I'm not sure on either of those. What I find really encouraging from the logistics sector is it has almost self-policed itself to be very environmentally focused. Partly it becomes, as you say, because of the way finance comes forward and the incentives for greener buildings, but also many of the end users of these buildings, which you may not know when you build them, are demanding very efficient, low energy, green buildings as part of their estate. I find it quite interesting. The first 2 years of Parliament, we have talked a lot about regulation. We had the Fingleton Review, we had the Planning and Infrastructure Act, there was a big discussion about environmental regulation. And now in the King's Speech, there is a specific bill around how do we set and cut regulation to help businesses deliver. So it's a really interesting time to be discussing, is there a need to add a further level of regulation in this space? Is that needed to drive this? In a kind of an environment where generally the industry and the business community is saying, can you cut regulation to help us go faster and go quicker? So I'm not sure whether this fits into that view of, can we reduce the cost of delivery, but certainly it feels like it's something that's needed and actually the industry has naturally adopted anyway.
Okay, thank you. Ollie, from your perspective, we'll maybe talk in a minute about when we don't know the occupiers, but can you just sort of outline how much the use of the asset can vary from one type of occupier to another when it comes to logistics?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, certainly with logistics, and the occupiers vary so much, even the unit itself. You've got single-sided or a cross-dock, an occupier might be using it 24/7, they might only using it, 9 hours a day. It might be racked out, it might be automated. It can vary so much, and so how the occupier is going to be using that building is obviously going to have a massive impact on that operational carbon, which is obviously going to have a huge impact in reporting and the requirements, to align with the standard.
And as a developer, how does that change how you think about this standard, for example? You're upstream, but you're thinking about the eventual user as well.
Yeah, it has an impact. Obviously, we have to do modelling to take it into account. We can only make assumptions. That's a difficult thing. These buildings these days, they're resilient with electrification, automation coming forward, robotics. These buildings have to be adaptable going forward, and that's what we're seeing in the market from our customers. They're looking for a space that they can evolve in. Most of these are taking spaces now 10, 15 years that they're going to look to expand and grow their own businesses. And the future of, logistics is electrification, and hopefully that's, and so we need to be able to provide an asset that can evolve with them.
And from your point of view, Aaron, when you're actually building these sorts of assets, again, thinking about the eventual user and moving to a place where we're measuring lots of metrics right through from development through to use, how does that affect the way you carry out your work or think about it?
Well, it comes back to obviously design, it comes back to data, it comes back to how verifiable that data is that you're using to provide these metrics. So when you're looking at embodied carbon, there's different types of metrics that are available. Some products have EPDs, some products have TM65s, and it's looking at the variables of what you're getting and how long that data is then being transposed for. So when you're doing a whole life carbon assessment, you're looking at a 25-year stance and a 60-year stance, and that 60-year is looking at operational and maintenance of that building and those materials for the lifespan of the building through to it eventually being demolished. So having reliability, transparent data, it starts to inform those decisions early on. And then also from an operational perspective, it comes back to how much information you've got from the developer and the tenants to put into that original design model. So one thing the Net Zero Building Standard does now is that you're asking those questions of the developer early on rather than waiting till PC or post PC once a developer's on board. So having that more informed strategy now gets you to a more reliable set of metrics and data that we can then push forward with.
Yeah. And let's start to talk then perhaps about, you know, getting from where we are now to actually putting this into practice. It is voluntary.
Mm-hmm.
Ollie, from your perspective, you know, what are the initial sort of barriers to use or things that, you know, you've got to work through here?
I think one of them's, I suppose, the data collection. It varies so much. Even just trying to, as an asset manager, trying to obtain that data from an occupier, the quality of that data that comes back, whether you can get it at all, you know, the systems that are in place, the reporting requirements, it seems to vary so much. So I think that's one of the big barriers. But then I think as well, you know, with the standard, it's going to focus so much on, let's say, the electrification, grid reforms that are needed, being able to obtain that power. It's a massive issue, you know, and industrials, as I say, it's location, and then when can you get that power? And sometimes those, you know, you can't get that power for 10 plus years, and at which point it doesn't become a viable scheme. So it will be a barrier unless things change and come forward.
And Philippa, from your perspective, I mean, thinking about sort of constraints around grid and so on, you know, what would make the biggest difference there? How much of a barrier is this to implementing the standard?
In terms of the implementation of the standard, I mean, I would say it kind of comes back to sort of due diligence associated with site, location, etc., and sort of bringing that right at the front of where you're choosing to get sites, even though I appreciate sites it's very difficult to get hold of in this space. But that's one thing. I suppose we have identified from our members that there are barriers in terms of access to renewable energy and sharing renewable energy back, I think more specifically. And that is a work stream that we're looking at investigating in this next FY. And we're currently in the midst of putting together a state of a state report on the grid, looking at barriers and enablers in terms of sort of supply, demand and network. Just because we are seeing this issue, and especially in this sector where I think there was a statistic yesterday, I wasn't specifically at that talk, but it said about how much energy this sector could actually provide if all of the roofs were covered in PV. Yeah. I don't know if anyone can shout out what that stat was, if anyone was in that room, but I think it was quite significant. I think it was something like 25%. So I think, yes, there are things we've got to pick apart, but I suppose the key thing is that us having this standard is pushing us forwards to have these conversations to then break down these barriers, but we don't want to sort of let perfect be the enemy of the good. Here, like we need this progress. Yeah. So yeah, let's unpick these barriers, find them, and actually have the conversations to push on through.
Great. And just thinking about what you were starting to say about data, James, how does this look in terms of, you know, how you might advise a developer to start thinking about its data collection from day one and beyond, given that it then hands over to someone else and that still contributes to the standard?
Well, I'd say data, as has been mentioned repeatedly, data is the most important thing. There is a lot of data needed. That data is incredibly valuable to allow us to keep the momentum, to keep learning about performance, and to just make it easier to start engaging more and more with the standard and it become part of common practice, because it is very new, the standard. You know, in its first form, it's only been out for 3 months, so it's really early days. We had some pilot projects that have gone for it, but the more that clients, developers engage with the standard, start to understand exactly what data is needed, start to be able to think about these things early in the process as well, because I think the other important thing is these pass-fail limits, like the embodied carbon limit. I think Aaron mentioned earlier about that early engagement. If you start thinking about if you do some modelling at the end of the project, it's pass or fail. You're unlikely to be able to actually then comply with the standard. You have to think about it early. You have to be able to influence specification of materials. You have to be able to think about the energy demand of the building and making sure that that's factored in good design principles to minimise that demand. So engage with it early, understand what data is needed and why it's actually really valuable data, and it will really help the industry to keep engaging with the standard. And yeah, just try and focus on implementing the standard a bit more, even if you can't fully engage with it. You know, there are various different things you have to do to meet the standard, but even if you can start to chip away, looking at embodied carbon, looking at your energy intensity, looking at your renewables, it's a fantastic step forward in itself.
Yeah, I was just gonna build upon that as well. Obviously, hopefully people have seen that there's obviously the performance verification option as well for those that are on that journey. So just engage with that, see how well you're going to be performing against the limits as a starting point.
Can you describe what that is, Philippa?
Yeah, so essentially it's obviously engaging with the standard, looking at the limits, and obviously still pressing on and trying to achieve as many of those compliers with many of those targets and limits as possible. But you know, at the end, you will have a certificate which explains just how well you've done against each of the criteria, and show, you know, sort of percentage difference, and it just shows that you're trying. And obviously, the key is that we need this data as an industry, and we need to be collating this to move forward. So, it's not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good again.
So that's about having a sort of work in progress type assessment that maybe shows up a gap between, you know, the standard over here and where a particular development is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Essentially, it shows how well the building has performed against the standard, irrespective of whether the limits have been met or not. It's showing that organisation and that built development has been on a journey and actually tried their best, which is key as well to
And
acknowledge.
is trying one's best here exposing? I mean, I guess I'm thinking from a contractor and maybe from a developer's perspective as well. Is there, maybe not yourselves, but is there a sense that there might be a reluctance for people to put the data out there to start measuring in case they don't like what they find out?
I think you need to go back a couple of steps. 'Cause obviously, like a year or so ago, Rick's introduced the V2 version of the LCA framework, and then obviously BREEAM's now changed to BREEAM V7. So under planning policy already, if you're having to deliver a BREEAM V6 or a V7 assessment, quite a lot of this information is readily already available, and you're having to meet these metrics to get a pass or an outstanding or an excellent rating in the BREEAM. And what has happened over the last 6 months, which is what the industry has been calling for, is that the three bodies now have started to align. So
Right.
what you're having to do under BREEAM is very similar to what you're now having to do as net zero building standard, and what also RICS are now asking you in terms of whole life cycle reporting. So there is a drive collectively now that sees that each asset needs to do something. So if you are already doing BREEAM, looking at the net zero building standard, I think you're 50-60% of the way there of what the net zero building standard is asking for. So there is some cohesion in moving forward. So I wouldn't say there should be a reluctance from people to do it if you're having to do a BREEAM assessment anyway.
And Mike, maybe this is a question for you, but it sounds like, you know, is there a risk that there are multiple standards and,
Yes.
you know, then there's confusion, and that might not be so much at the industry level, but, you know, does it matter if the general public is a bit confused about what the difference is between this standard and BREEAM or?
Yes, I'll come to that in a second. I was just thinking about data. So I think that's the biggest challenge is data sharing in getting this working. And having worked for a tier one, you know, the data is your IP, and information sharing between tier one contractors particularly is really, really difficult. You know, I sat on a project at Mace where we tried to democratize some of our data. You know, we felt like this 30 years of delivering some of the most complex projects in London gave us a unique data set that with the advent of AI, we could start to really look at kind of predictive analysis of how we can think about risk, how we can think about schedule, how we can think about stakeholder challenges, design challenges. Getting the business to think we could then share kind of performance data with our competitors becomes a real challenge when you're in a competitive marketplace where that performance data arguably is going to be what you're going to use to sell yourself to the next client, to say, here's our creds, look how fantastic we are. And so it's a really interesting challenge for industry. How do you get an environment people feel comfortable sharing their data in a competitive commercial environment where that data actually is often the decision maker between whether you or someone else is better and selected for that next project? Does it matter if there are competing standards? I don't think it does. I think we have always had a number of different standards in a world of things. You know, I came up through when we had BREEAM and RICS SCAR for laboratories and all sorts of other standards that emerged. And the best ones naturally come to the top because the clients start using them. What happens is when you see that adoption by clients, particularly so in the public sector with BREEAM, that standard starts to become adopted. And does it matter if the public don't understand it? Probably not. What they want to know is that they want to trust us. We're delivering green buildings, we're delivering buildings that are energy efficient, and ultimately the buildings aren't going to impact on their lives. They just want to get us to get on and do it, I think, is probably the answer.
Yeah. And going back to that point about sort of IP and data, is that partly a cultural challenge to overcome? What do you think the solutions in this context are?
I think it is a very big cultural challenge. You know, so I used to be a collaborative working mentor with Constructing Excellence, and we talk a lot about how do we share data, how do we share best practice. It's really challenging because what's the commercial incentive if you're a contractor or you're a consultant to share information with other people? And I think it's the same with end user data. What's the commercial incentive for the end user to have someone to collect data or to provide that data? That's a really hard business case to sell when margins are always very tight in our sector. And there's 101 things that businesses need to look at. So I think you have to find a way to incentivize people to share data, and to find a way to do it that you can do it in a way that still protects commercial sensitivities of the the operator, of the end user, and of the builders themselves.
Ollie, how do you? Oh, come to you in a minute, James. How do you handle something like making the business? I mean, we're all here on the panel, so presumably you guys are on board. But how do you make that case commercially for that kind of data sharing?
The case for data sharing, I suppose it's, that's where we have to lean on, certainly the end users, and be driving that into green lease clauses and being able to get, most of the customers we're dealing with are blue chip. They've got their own net zero decarbonisation plans they're following, so they're willing to do so. But you'd be surprised, some are still reluctant to share the data. Some want you to sign NDAs, some outright refuse, some won't sign it, You get a green lease clause, it can vary how dark a green you want it to go. But I think the biggest thing is going to be that collaboration, realising, this standard isn't just about one individual stakeholder in this process, it's focusing on everyone. So I think, as a developer, the standard is going to set out a softer landing for us it probably comes a bit down to upskilling as well, making tenants realise what we've achieved, building a net zero shell, and handing it over to them, and then if they're wanting to align with that, which, as I say, some of the big blue chips will do, and it naturally will be picked up, but there's going to be an educational piece as well. It goes back to Philippa's point, this isn't going to be perfect straight away, and I think that's just why it's important that, we jump on this as early as you can, because there's going to be a few learning curves.
And start talking about it.
Yeah.
James?
I was just going to say, on the data point, there's an indirect benefit as well associated with data. So even if there is an issue about sharing data amongst, for the assets, for the key kind of parties, in embodied carbon terms, the data comes from the supply chain, the data comes from the products and the materials and the processes. So whether there is a willingness to share data between two of the main kind of parties, if they're both asking the same supplier for their embodied carbon accreditation for an absolute detail on emissions associated with that same product, because we use a lot of the same products, that pressure is very handy, because at the minute, the other thing we lack in data terms is not every product, not every process is kind of adequately covered. And we need to be putting pressure on the supply chain to start providing that data to make the overall building, the overall performance more accurate, and also improve it as well, because that pressure will help to encourage innovation and kind of carbon savings in the supply chain, which will make a very big difference in embodied carbon terms.
I was going to say we should take comfort in the fact that there were so many organisations that submitted projects as part of the pilot process to inform the criteria of the standard. So I think we do have I suppose we're trying to facilitate a more comfortable environment to allow people to bring their data to the table without worrying too much about it. I mean, Aaron, you guys had pilot projects in the mix.
Yeah, so again, I think one of the fundamental changes that we've seen is that EPDs before for data for specific materials used to be quite broad brush. So they used to be just if you had concrete, there'd be a concrete EPD. Now under the standard, you have to have an EPD for that specific process. So there's 200, 300 ways of how concrete can be made, and they're batched in different. Then there's different regulations with regards to temperatures, when they're laid, when they're not laid. So having the data now to each process allows that to be factors in, and I think that's one issue or one challenge we've had with our supply chain is to actually get the relevant data and EPDs for the specific process that we're undertaking, rather than a wholesale, what this is the EPD for this product, when there's 9-10 different iterations of that product.
And is that, do you see your role in that as having to explain, persuade? I mean, what does that look like?
It's been, so with the UKJBC, we've done a decarbonising the supply chain partnership agreement. So we've had to go through processes. So over the last 3 years, we've worked with our supply chain, we've had workshops, we've had discussions, we've sat down and looked at the processes they need to adopt with themselves in a business, and how they can then get that data into an EPD form. I think the EPD process is now started to become a little bit more easier to manage as well. It used to be quite convoluted before, so now getting an EPD for your product is a lot more easier, and there's more different ways to actually achieve that criteria. So getting the right data now is becoming an easier process than perhaps what it was 3 years ago.
What about skills? I mean, Ollie, you mentioned it a little bit, but in terms of where we are now and where we need to get to, you know, in the immediate term, what does upskilling here need to look like, and how are we going about that?
I think it's just an educational piece in terms of, you know, making sure people are aware of what data is required, and, you know, but it, you know, again, for me, from an asset management point of view, handing over that building, you know, the BMS systems that go into these buildings these days are not straightforward. So you need a qualified person to be able to, one, maintain it, and two, be able to extract the data. You know, these are, you know, the energy management of that building as well needs to be, you know, carefully managed. It's not a case of just turning it on and off. If you're really focusing on that operational carbon, there's, you know, a lot can be done. And as I say, it goes back to the supply chain as well, doesn't it? And it probably just as a reporting requirement, seems to be there's different versions, different formats that need to be coming through. So standardising that and just help it, make it simpler for everyone, I think is the key as well. There seems to be so many different ways people are wanting this data, but if we can simplify the process, I think that helps as well.
Yeah. And Mike, thinking about it at a sort of industry-wide level, perhaps, there's obviously quite a lot of talk anyway about where skills are needed in construction. You know, is this something that should be very much built in from the outset, and, you know, embedded in those calls from government and other places to really think about how skills can be developed?
I think embedded in what's already happening, yes. So I sound like I've got a million jobs. I also sit on the Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee, and we scrutinise the role of Miliband and DESNES. And we've done a full inquiry on kind of green skills and what do we need the skills for the energy transition, which kind of is similar to this conversation. And what we found was that quite often the additional green skills that people might need is bolted on to traditional educational paths,
right,
rather than embedded from day one. And
it's like an extra module.
It's like an
rather
extra
than
module.
core.
Yeah. And, you know, and this is perhaps more looking at, you know, heat pumps. Why is that an additional thing when you're learning to be a gas engineer rather than embedded day one from being when you're learning to be a gas engineer at college? But I think the same applies here. Academia has to keep up with what industry needs, and there's a real role, and actually it's where organisations like the UK Green Building Council play such a critical role to make sure that the course, you know, the course programs, the academic programs that we use in education match what's needed by industry, and likewise for lifelong learning through the institutions particularly, that they're also working to understand what industry is doing, standards like this, and making sure the CPD that they offer is helping people throughout their career to continue to upskill and support initiatives like this.
Okay, thanks. Just thinking about risk a little bit. I mean, Ollie, you talked about maybe not knowing who the occupier is going to be, and also, you know, we're talking here about supply chain as well. Given that this is a standard that applies, you know, from the very start right through to operation, how do we make sure that, you know, people don't hold back from this because they're worried that they'll end up sort of holding the baby in one way or another? James?
Well, I think the standard is started to introduce new ways for developers, clients to engage with it without having to necessarily wholeheartedly be from start to finish, because it appreciates now that you can't necessarily do that in sectors like industrial logistics, speculative. So I think the introductions of things like the practical completion on track pre-verification is incredibly useful.
So what is that?
So practical completion on track means that you can engage with the standard at completion. So you're not waiting. That in-use performance verification, which is very important and one of the core purposes of the standard, that 1 year of metered data of occupation that causes such a challenge for storage and distribution. The PC on track approach allows you to engage with the standard and submit and get your data checked and get your performance checked at completion without an end user involved at all. And so you can still check how you're doing and get that pre-verified approval through a rigorous quality assurance process, someone who's trained to check this stuff, which again has not always been available in the industry. You can go through that process and your finished building on, at day one that doesn't have an occupier can still engage with the standard and can still show how it's doing without the risk that when a tenant comes in later, if the engagement isn't there, if the performance isn't there in that sense, you've still got that pre-verification. And I think that's very important for industrial logistics, where this standard and net zero carbon is such an important selling point, needs that engagement at that point to be able to bring the tenants in and bring like-minded tenants in as well who may want to continue engaging with the standard and get that full verification.
Yeah, and presumably that comes back to your point about it also being a process where people are sort of almost practicing and getting used to the process that actually matters as much as the data.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, it's just, and there's other facets of the standard as well, like there's the Pathfinder arrangement as well for, obviously we're talking specifically about logistics here, but there's other sectors where I think it's known that we need more data. So there are many different ways to get into being involved with the standard.
Okay. I've got some questions coming in, so thank you for those. Please keep them coming. Just before we come on to that, just a question about planning. To what degree, is there a risk that planning inconsistency can undermine this standard? Who'd like to talk about that?
I think
Aaron, do you want to talk about that?
one of the reasons that we've launched this white paper is that we're seeing that there's lots of deviations up and down the country from what we're being asked to undertake when we put developments together. So if we're in the London area and you're working with the London plan goes quite onerously and quite rigorously into very detailed assessments of how the building works, what you need to do, the criteria that you need to meet, and most of that criteria is probably already more onerous than what the net zero building standard is asking for. And then as you start to go up the country, you seem to hit spots where there is no regulation, there is no requirements for data, and then you'll suddenly jump into a council where they've suddenly got more rigorous requirements, and that seems to be like the issue up and down the country. There is no continual requirement for everyone to follow the same suit, and that was one of the reasons why we've engaged in this piece of work, because we feel that for everyone to get on track and start to do this, there needs to be some sort of push to meet that regulatory requirement.
How do you find it sort of at a local level? Are you having to deal with different standards or expectations? Are you having to educate different planning authorities around some of these things?
Yeah, slightly. As Aaron said, for us it just creates a bit of confusion. It delays the process. You are dealing with some local authorities like where they have the GLA, and then others are just still focusing very much on an EPC, and it's there's so much in between that. So when you're like us, when we're covering the whole of the UK, it's very much obviously we have a standard specification, so we know we're going for beyond that, and we can take it into account. But for a smaller developer, the margins are tighter. It does make it more complicated.
What's your feeling, Mike, about how this sort of where the interface should be with planning, what that should look like?
There is a challenge that local authority and councillors particularly don't always see the connection between their aspirations in terms of standards that they want to see and then the cost of delivery. And I've had this conversation with my own council. There's a housing delivery board in Northamptonshire which looks at which brings in industry to talk about how do we deliver our housing targets. And we kind of put it back to the council because they wanted to introduce grey water harvesting as a standard in all houses, I think it was, new build housing. We said, well, what's the cost actually? And they hadn't considered the cost that would put on building houses in Northamptonshire, and what that would mean in terms of things. What they could see, and the councillors could see, is it's the right thing to do. We want to do the right thing in terms of the green agenda without really considering the knock-on effect. One of the things that I'm trying to get off the ground for Labour councillors is some training on viability through one of the kind of Labour affiliated societies, because actually it's something that councillors don't really understand. I saw Lord Banner, Charlie Banner, proposing that there should be requirement for all councillors to get accredited in planning. And if they can't be accredited, they can't sit on a planning committee, which I thought was a really interesting proposal. And I said to him, well, I saw him yesterday. I said, what happens if no one's accredited? Would we just say yes to everything? But I think there is a need for councillors to really understand, A, the standards that they're kind of asking officers to implement, but B, how they then apply that to planning. And I think, unfortunately, with the political situation we have at the moment, with a big swathe of new councillors, particularly councillors who aren't very political, to not name specific parties, but councillors that signed a form on Facebook to say I'd like to be a councillor and got elected, that they don't realise that actually the power they have and the role they have in both driving standards and also then
And the responsibility.
controlling them at the planning stage. And so I think we could see a real hodgepodge of kind of planning application approaches done across the country, which probably is quite worrying for developers, and which is where having a standard that industry can look to, and in the engagement with councils say, look, here's a standard you could look to in terms of how you bring best practice in without having a massive impact on industry and stifling growth. I think this is why this is a really good way of doing that.
Do you want to comment on that, Philippa? I mean, is that something in terms of the UKGBC that there's an opportunity there around education or political interface? I
think generally, obviously, we'd love to see more sustainability embedded in planning requirements. And obviously, the great thing about performance verification of the standard is, it's something that could be integrated that doesn't necessarily hold developers to account on specific targets and limits, because we know, obviously, throughout the process of delivering a building, things might flex and shift. But yeah, I mean, we've run training sessions with planning consultants, and we're trying to get them to understand, what is it. We don't want to be relying too much on just badges, but also understanding what those badges mean as well. And I think what the good thing about the standard is that it does what it says on the tin. It's about delivering. It's about delivering net zero. But yeah, I think the planners do need to understand what it is they're asking for. I think that's the key thing, as opposed to sort of just jumping on the bandwagon with specific elements. And obviously, we'd love the standard across the whole UK to be raised, so it's not just in the hot zones of London where they're asking for the strongest developments. We'd love to see this filter out across the rest of the UK.
I think to add to that point as well on kind of viability and cost, and the standard being another thing and a challenge, what we can't lose sight of is the fact that the standard, it's not just about net zero carbon, it's not just about doing the right thing, it's also about improving energy security with renewables, requiring us to generate more in each of our buildings, so we're not as reliant on other things. It's about reducing bills. If you reduce your energy demand, you're reducing the amount you've got to pay for. So there is a financial upside to being net zero carbon. It's not just about the climate crisis. It's also about making sure our assets are sustainable in the long term, and part of that is financial sustainability as well.
Yeah. And that's obviously something that I think has come out of talks that I've been at the past 2 weeks, is that we will need to speak that language and draw out those benefits that affect the people and the occupants day to day, as opposed to I think obviously net zero has been seen as being a bit more of a loaded term recently. We know we need to do it. We need to make sure we're speaking the language of whoever we're talking to upsell it and keep it moving.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, whether the term is always helpful. Obviously, it's baked into the title of this standard, although it's also got the longest acronym ever. But is that something where sometimes actually it's better sort of not to talk about net zero? But
I think it is a very good point, because talk about energy security garners a completely different idea in people's minds than net zero, but they're fundamentally the same thing, aligned. You couldn't take this standard to my council because the word net zero is banned in West Northamptonshire. So the officers call it other things to get the councillors to agree to stuff. So you couldn't take this in as the net zero standard, but you could take it in as energy reduction and business efficiency standard or something, and they go, that sounds a great idea, let's do it. So I think the term net zero unfortunately has become toxic, and politicians have arguably made that term toxic in some environments, and it is certainly a challenge that we now have to face when we bring things like this forward.
Yeah. It's quite an interesting one, isn't it? Right, I'm going to start bringing in questions. I've got some here, but also if you've got a burning question, please stick your hand up. I think we've got mics around the room, and also it's not that big in here, so we can always shout. One of the questions is from an anonymous person, so I don't know who this person is in the room, but saying pressure on suppliers has barriers such as impact of availability of resource, knowledge and investment. How does the panel suggest supporting suppliers with this? Who would like to start with that?
Well, so obviously our supply chain, as I mentioned earlier, we've gone back to a back to basics approach where we sat down, explained the reasons behind it, the rationale. We've supported the majority of our supply chain through the process. Yes, there are barriers that we have to overcome. I think the government's stance currently on the steel strategy hasn't helped the process with regards to RICS reporting and LCAs, and that is a barrier that we're currently working through and looking at in terms of getting reduced embodied carbon materials into these developments, and how that process of how the steel strategy is going to roll out is going to have an impact on low carbon and reduced carbon designs. But any barriers that we do face, whether it's political barriers or whether it's obviously the current situation in the Middle East having an impact on all sorts of elements of that supply chain, we take it on board, and we tend to sit down and help those suppliers. And I think it comes back to education. It's all not just about putting cost in and it's going to become more expensive. There's ways and means that you can meet those requirements still, and it's just laying that process down so people understand it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then you'd mentioned obviously sort of some of the very specifics around the market at the moment. We've got a question saying, with the current market, sourcing the low carbon materials at the right time is a challenge. Does the standard take into account the period of delivery?
So period of delivery, in embodied carbon terms, the limits that the standard would hold you to is the year at which you start on site. And so for any project that's starting on site next year, they'll have to meet that limit. Those limits do reduce over time. So the period of delivery is accounted for. You have time to plan for it. Year of start on site is quite a long time before projects first start being thought about. And if they're thinking about the standard at that point, they have a lot of time to prepare for what the eventual kind of limit will be as well. So it is factored in. It will go down over time as it has to, but as people start to gear up and kind of deal with the standard more, as suppliers deal with the standard more, then it should be on the same pathway.
Okay.
I would add a very brief point as well, on the supplier challenges. I think also see it as an opportunity, where if you've got a lot of people engaging with the standard and having to hit certain limits, it's very advantageous for a supplier to be able to say that they are lower carbon, that their product is leading the market or is improving by X or Y. That is a massive selling point for that supplier. So it's very much an opportunity as much as a risk.
Yeah, and there's benefits in both directions to sort of building that market, presumably. Aaron?
I was just going to say as well, under the standard now, that there's a target that's set that's broken down into 3 component parts. If you go back to what we were talking about earlier and designing early, if you were to break your embodied carbon, your operational maintenance, that building into the 3 pots, they're movable numbers that you can work within as long as you get to the overall target. So if you are having a bit of an additional carbon associated with
so
embodied
you can
carbon,
sort of move the impact
but
around.
it comes down to how you've designed that building and making sure you factor in that data correctly, which can overcome some of the issues that we're currently facing.
Okay. And then one bit about tenants and operators, and Ollie, you did mention this earlier, but perhaps we can explore it a bit more. Sort of how ready are tenants and operators, facilities managers, to operate and maintain buildings to this standard? And how can the standard help support stakeholders?
Yeah, I think a lot of the bigger companies are ready. They do have facility teams that are capable of taking on these sort of complex buildings now. The data sharing point is obviously key. It's working with the occupiers in order. The data's there, and that's the difficult thing we always find is the data's there, whether it's the utilities company's got it, whether the tenant's got it. And if we want to be collaborative and work together towards, reporting this whole life carbon, we need to find a way of sharing this data straightforward, more simply. I think tenants are generally ready. Some of the smaller tenants, whether it's Joe Bloggs running a shed on his own, it's a different story, isn't it? That's where the standard may trip up some of those occupiers. The smaller businesses they're not focused on whether they're sending their meter readings through that's where it will probably start to differentiate. But as I say, with those bigger tenants that do have their own ambitions and net zero targets, that's where you're going to get a lot of the buy-in initially, I'm sure.
Okay, David, you had a question.
Yeah, hi, I'm David Partridge. I actually chair the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standards Governance Board. So first of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all you guys for supporting education, especially. I just want to clarify the point about data and data security. If you submit a building for verification, you will be required to submit your data to the verifier. They are under an agreement with you under their terms and conditions to give you a score. They will say you've met this limit or you haven't. And then that comes back to the standard and we issue the appropriate certificate, whether it's net zero carbon aligned, if you hit all the limits, or the performance evaluation that says you missed out on this one, you've got green with all of these, but you missed this. And it will tell you just simply, I missed that limit by plus 5%, plus 10. That data doesn't go to anybody else. So it doesn't go to anybody else who's putting their building in. It will then get anonymized, go into the BECD, and we will then be able to draw on that in the future to be able to say, oh, all those people who put in their buildings for logistics, warehousing, blah, 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 this was the overall scores that they achieved, how close were the limits, blah, 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 blah. That will allow us to then, in the next standard, go, well, okay, actually we've been really tough on these guys. No one's achieving that particular limit. Maybe we need to look at it. Or actually, this one's really easy in the sector. Let's adjust. So that is all anonymized. So don't worry. You go for verification, and that's the bit that I would like the regulators to do, is to say you don't have to necessarily to conform to the standard 100% and get your net zero carbon aligned status, which hopefully the market, if you do it, the market will reward you for that. But if everyone goes for verification, we get more and more buildings through the process, assessing their data, putting together their evidence, doing everything that you guys have been talking about, and then that leads back to to better standards next time round, and the limits then get applied. So thank you again for everything that you've done in promoting it. There's a lot more for us to learn. I think you said it in your thing. It's for the industry, by the industry, and I think that's actually been really critical. And hopefully, again, government will see this as something that industry isn't just doing this because we want to make it easy for ourselves. We're making it really tough on ourselves to get this right. But if we all support it, then I think actually we can demonstrate to government that we're actually being really responsible in the way that we're taking it on. So whether we call it net zero or something else, ultimately it's a good thing for society and will encourage growth. Like you said, lots of opportunities for people who are prepared. That wasn't a good question.
It's all right. It's an important point, David. Yeah. It is important to reassure people on that.
There's going to be industrial espionage going on behind.
Question at the back there.
Hi, Mark from TVNA. Yeah, thank you for a great presentation. I just wanted to pick up the point you raised about the 25% of UK energy generation from roofs. My understanding, one of the limiting factors about generation from logistic hub roofs is the exporting back to the grid, be it connection capacity or simply the cost of return. Could the standard help support, in your opinion, a better value add for generation, such as shadow carbon price, or perhaps a portfolio approach, so you could share energy generation around different assets?
Who'd like to talk to that? James? Mike, yeah?
I don't mind talking about this. So, one of the limiting factors is capacity of the distribution network. The government has focused on transmission initially, in terms of strengthening our grid, and I think there will have to be further reforms, and there will be reforms coming, I think, in the Energy Reform Bill in this King's Speech on how the DNOs work more effectively to build that resilience. But it is one of the limiting factors. It's the only one. The other one is feed-in tariffs and how that works. We could fix the grid, but unless we fix the commercial arrangements for the building owners to be putting energy back into the grid, then it doesn't stack up commercially either. So there's work to do. And at the UK, if anyone's very interested, the UK Warehouse Association has done a very detailed study and report into how this all works. It was launched last year at Labour Party conference, and it's not an easy solution. But I do chew Michael Shanks's ear about it every time I see him, the Energy Minister. So it's something that we continue to lobby on and try and get the department to focus a bit more on.
Great, thank you. One more question here.
Hi, George Beard.
Can you talk up, George?
Sorry, I'm suffering from UK roof flu.
Sorry.
I'll do my best to speak up. George Beard, Public Affairs Consultancy, College Group. Thank you so much for a really insightful discussion today. I'll just have a quick question about what, in your eyes, the phased transition would look like in terms of timescales if regulatory backing were to come forward, and also how these sort of expectations and requirements would increase over time as well. Be keen to get thoughts from the panel.
Okay, so the question for anyone that maybe didn't hear was about phased transition, whether the standards might raise over time and what the sort of implementation of regulation might look like on a sort of stage-by-stage basis. James?
So the standard is already adjusted to increase over time or decrease your allowances over time anyway. And so that is baked into the whole methodology of the standard. For us to be net zero carbon by 2050, the limits have to keep going down year on year. So that is very much in there already, it's accounted for. In terms of phased engagement, I think as we've all been saying, actually the first stepping stone, a fantastic thing is getting the data. So I imagine there would have to be a period of time where if this were introduced, you'd need to make sure that people are able to engage with it, able to collect the right data up before you then immediately introduced a really tricky target for them to hit. Because I think that's a little bit too much for certain sectors, certain clients to kind of to take in one go. So there would have to be a degree of phasing. Exactly how much, I'm not sure. Some sectors are ready for it, some less so. But I do think you would need a period of time, get the right data in place, and then start to engage with the limits. But it's very important the limits stay where they are in the standard, because they are, it's all science-based. The whole approach the standard is taken. The limits are purposefully going down. So by the time we get to 2050, we have a decarbonised sector, essentially. So the way that they drop down over time, that can't change. But I suppose I would just encourage people to engage quicker, because then you've got a slightly less punitive limit to hit, the earlier you get involved with the standard.
Great, thank you. All right, well, we're out of time for questions, I think. Thank you for your questions. Just before we close, I think it'd be a good moment in thinking, following on from that question nicely, to just perhaps think about everybody just going down the panel quickly, just the one thing in the next 12, 18 months that you would like to see to make sure that this happens. Ollie, I'm going to start with you and come this way.
I think from my side, I think engagement from investors and occupiers, the recognition of the standard, I think it would be great over the next couple of years. They gets taken into account.
Yeah.
Basically.
So awareness and people actually starting to use it. James.
National legislation on embodied carbon.
Okay.
It's currently not catered for.
Specific ask, Mike. If you could just sort that out.
Yes. Let me ring the PA.
No pressure.
I think I'm very similar, actually. I think a critical mass of clients, investors, developers adopting this would create that momentum to bring this forward without perhaps needing regulation.
Okay. Aaron?
Mine would be alignment so that everyone's working to the same metrics.
Yeah, great.
I mean, they've done it all, haven't they?
You must have another one.
No, I think so. Yeah, it's just getting engaged with the standard, and obviously just measuring carbon at a literally base level. Just measure carbon, because as soon as you've got that benchmark to self-assess against, that's where it all starts.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I think we've all learnt a lot about both the detail and the bigger picture here today, which I think that balance is really important. Thank you for your questions and for coming this morning. And if you'll just join me in thanking our panellists, Ollie, James, Mike,